Makes Me Wanna Holler by Nathan McCall. Chapter 43 Cycles. My arrival in D.C. was more than just a good career move. It put me closer to a ghost of the past I needed to confront. Her name was Carolyn, and even though I hadn't seen or talked to her since I was 18, she'd haunted me for years. Back during the days when the fellas and I were running trains and raising hell, I met Carolyn at a local amusement park. We rapped and got together one night when my parents were out of town. For me, it was supposed to be a quick hit and forget, a slam bam thank you ma'am. I picked her up on the designated corner, took her to my house and got over. A month later, Carolyn told me she was pregnant. No way, I told her. We'd only been together that once. I figured that given the ease with which I had gotten her into bed, other dudes had likely done the same. When she insisted she was pregnant by me, I thought up a scheme to duck the blame. The fellas and I would run a train to try and create confusion about paternity. Naively, we figured that if a number of guys said they had trained a girl, she couldn't possibly know who was the father of her child. One night, I had Carolyn meet me at the Zeus Club in Douglas Park. Using my stepfather's car, I took her for a cruise, with my friend Greg riding shotgun. A group of the fellas followed inconspicuously in a different car. On the way to the lake, where we planned to run the train, Carolyn noticed the other car. She got hysterical and began to scream, "Nathan, stop the car and let me out." I said, "Be cool, girl, it'll be alright." "Nathan, if you don't stop the car, I'm gonna jump." I tried to scare her by accelerating, but the next thing I knew, Carolyn, who was sitting in the front passenger seat, opened the door, jumped from the car, and landed in the street, smashing her head against the pavement. The car behind us swerved sharply and barely avoided running her over. I pulled to the side of the road and ran back to where Carolyn lay motionless. The impact had knocked her unconscious. She went into convulsions, spewing foam from her mouth and trembling like she was having a seizure. Of course, the guys in the other car split. After helping us load Carolyn into the back seat of my stepfather's car, they left Greg and me to handle it alone. We drove her back across town near her sister's house, parked in a wooded area, and tried unsuccessfully to bring her to. She really needed medical care. Greg said, "We better take her to the hospital." I was too scared. "We can't, man. If we take her to the hospital, they're going to call the fuzz." You never know what you're capable of doing until confronted with that kind of irrational, crazy fear. Several times before, fear had driven me to do foolish things with potential consequences far severer than the fate I was trying to avoid. That night, I concluded we had no option left except for the most desperate. I told Greg, "If anybody finds out what happened to her, we're going to jail. We gotta kill her, man. We ain't got no choice. We can throw her in those bushes over there." Years later, Greg told me he had no intention of going through with my idea, but that night he looked like he was willing. All I know is I decided it was something I had to do, and I was feeling desperate enough to carry it out. As we talked, an elderly woman walked up from nowhere and passed the car. Noticing Carolyn lying motionless in the back seat, she stopped and asked, "Is anything wrong?" Moving closer to the car, she spoke again, pointing to the back seat. "What's the matter with that child?" Nothing's wrong, ma'am. She just had a little too much to drink and we're trying to help her get herself together before we took her home." "You sure she all right?" The woman was still peering into the car, straining in the pitch dark to get a better look. "Yeah, she'll be all right. She just needs some fresh air, that's all. We're going to take her home." "All right. If y'all need help with anything, come and knock on my door." She pointed toward a lone house set off along the road, back in the woods. It was strange. I hadn't noticed that house when we first parked out there. After the woman left, it was clear that killing Carolyn was out of the question. The woman had seen our faces. She saw our car. Greg looked at Carolyn and said, "We gotta take her home now." I said, "I ain't taking her. I don't want her people to see me." Greg left me on the corner and took her home alone, rang the doorbell, and told Carolyn's sister she'd had too much to drink. Then he returned and picked me up. A few days later, my folks got a telephone call from Carolyn's parents. She had been hospitalized. Her father said she had told them she'd been out with me. He wanted an explanation and hinted he might call the cops. With my mother and stepfather, I went to their house to explain. Sitting in the living room with the four stern-faced adults, I made up an account of what went down. They listened calmly, then talked among themselves. Carolyn's parents seemed disinclined to drag the police into it. They were decent, hard-working people, much like my own parents. They asked me to leave the room. I don't know what was said. All I knew or cared about was that I got off the hook. Some months later, Carolyn delivered a baby girl. I never saw the child before I was sent to the joint. After I got out of prison, Carolyn moved to Washington and we lost contact. But not entirely. Toward the end of my stay in Atlanta, I learned my mother had been in touch with Carolyn from time to time in those intervening years. My mother and my stepfather had taken diapers and other supplies to Carolyn when the child was very young. Carolyn had written letters to me and sent them to my mother's address. Mama never showed them to me. She kept the letters until she got one just as I was about to leave Atlanta. She sent it to me. After I got settled in D.C., I did what I thought of doing for years. I got in touch with Carolyn and made arrangements to see her and her daughter in their place in Northeast Washington. By then, her daughter was about 18, 2 years older than Monroe. It was a trip seeing Carolyn after all those years. Short, petite, and coffee brown, she looked the same, right down to the gold tooth that sparkled in her mouth. She was warm and cordial. I wondered how she could bring herself to forgive me for what I had done to her. She never said anything about it, though, and acted like it never happened. Carolyn introduced me to Cheryl, her daughter, and I didn't know whether to hug her, kiss her, or shake her hand. She seemed reticent, too. I sensed she wanted to reach out, but was afraid to take the risk. As we talked, I searched her face for traces of myself. There were none. She had her mother's wide nose and thick eyebrows, and she was darker complexioned than either of us. Looking at her, I wondered, how could I have gone so long without trying to resolve this matter? Even as I asked myself that question, I half knew the answer. I was afraid to face the guilt it would bring if it turned out that I had other fatherhood responsibilities I had neglected to face. It will force me to accept the fact that despite all my efforts to be different from my blood father, JL, I was more like him than I realized. Cheryl and I got together a few more times after that first visit. I told her about my life and what it had been like when I met her mother. I was up front with her. I told her I was unsure if she was mine, but that I intended to find out. As soon as we get some blood tests done, we'll take it from there. I sought advice from friends and family, and even talked with a counselor about it. All of them told me, leave it alone. There's little you can do for her now at her age. But I resolved to try to do what was right if the test proved positive. Maybe I'd let her come live with me and make a new start. She dropped out of school in the 9th or 10th grade and wasn't doing much more with her life than hanging out and fighting. I talked to her about returning to school. It was evident from her blank expression and one-word responses that her concept of the value of an education was as vague as mine had once been. Thinking about my own past, I told her, anybody can rise above their situation in life. We didn't get a chance to see what she could do if given a shot at improving her life. Cheryl, who went back and forth to Portsmouth in impulsive fits, got pregnant by an unemployed hometown boy. She insisted on having the baby and making it on her own. She gave birth to a baby girl in Washington. I went to the hospital after work one day to visit her. A nurse stopped me at the entrance to the maternity ward and asked, the baby can only have visits from its parents and grandparents. Who are you? I said, my name is Nathan McCall. "Oh, you're the grandfather? Well, yeah. Go on in." She walked away. I stood there a second, stunned. Grandfather? I'm only 36. I entered the room where Cheryl was in bed, cradling her newborn baby like it was a play doll. Carolyn was there, along with a few other women I didn't know. The baby's father was nowhere to be found. The woman chatted gaily about the sweetness of motherhood. I remained quiet the entire time. I kept thinking about that nurse calling me a grandfather. I thought about the blood test that we needed to take. I thought about something else that was bugging me. It seemed I was still investing a lot of energy trying to straighten out all the crazy things I'd done in the past. When it was my turn to hold the baby, I couldn't pretend to share the joy that others felt. I kept looking into that baby's innocent eyes and thinking about the hell in store for her. Another fatherless black child, I thought. These cycles keep repeating themselves. One day, while I was sitting at my desk at work, a letter arrived from the Lorton prison just outside of D.C. It was from an inmate who said he'd seen my byline in the newspaper. He wanted to know if I was the same Nathan McCall who once did time with him at Southampton. I recognized the name right off. It was Mahdi, a homeboy from Portsmouth who was once part of the group of prison intellectuals I hung with at Southampton. I took the letter home, reread it a few times, and considered what to do. It was clear that Mahdi's letter was a plea for contact and support. I wrote him back, then went to see him. The prison was comprised of several institutions that warehoused a total of nearly 10,000 inmates, about 96% of them black. Lorton made Southampton look like a kindergarten. The place was so massive, it looked like a small rural town. They even had street names within the complex. It broke my heart to see all that black talent and energy wasting away. A few minutes after I got into the visiting room, Mahdi walked in, grinned broadly, and rushed over to the table to shake my hand. "Good to see you, my man. Thanks for coming all the way out here to visit me." It had been about 10 years since I had seen Mahdi. Tall and lean, he looked basically the same, but I couldn't help noticing that something about him was different. Of course he was older, about 35 now, but age was not the only factor in the change. The stress lines on his face indicated that this latest prison bid was rougher on him than the one before. Of course, there was an added strain of doing time so far away from home. That meant he seldom got visits from friends or family, and had to make do on the prison yard without protection from homeboys to watch his back. We talked for a good while. He said he served 9 years on a 40-year sentence and was due for parole in 1 more year. I've gotten a trade in brick masonry and plan to get a job working with a construction company when I get out. All I need is a union card and I'm on my way. He went on, "I'm thinking about relocating to D.C. I've been writing the sister of an inmate who lives in my dorm, and she wants me to come live with her and her 4 kids when I get out. I figure it shouldn't take me long to get on my feet. I'm going straight this time, man. I can't afford to take another fall." I sat there, listening quietly and thinking all the while, cycles. I've heard all this before. My old buddy from Southampton, Jim, and I talked about the cycles all the time. We'd get on the phone and talk long distance about the brothers we knew who'd gotten out, been killed, or sent back to the joint. At least 2 of the guys who were at Southampton with us had since committed other crimes and been sent to the electric chair. I was sure that many of those cats had every intention of doing what they said they would when they were released. But once they got out and confronted the harsh realities of the streets, they were overwhelmed. Sucked back into cycles they seemed unable to fend off. That's what had happened to Mahdi. He was sharp at Southampton, an understudy of Jim's. He'd gotten involved in Islam and become well-read and disciplined. I think he had near photographic memory. Once, I gave him a philosophical essay to read so he could join us in the next day's discussion on the prison yard. He came back and ran it down almost verbatim. The cat really had it together when he was locked up. When Jim and I got out, we continued going back to the joint to visit Marty to help him get through the rest of his bid. But after he got out, he began to change. He crept gradually back into the fast lane. At Southampton, he looked healthy and his skin was clear. But after he got back into drugs and hustling on the streets, his skin looked greasy and his face was gaunt. He even tossed aside his Muslim name and went back to using his old street name, Lil Willie. One night in 1982, Marty came with some friends to my house in Portsmouth. They were flying high as kites and talking pure trash. They stayed a while, then I told them I had things to do. When I walked them to the door, I pulled Marty aside and said, "Slow down, man, you're moving kinda fast." He looked at me through reddened eyes and said, "Don't worry, Nate, I got it under control." A short time later, Jim called and told me the news. Marty and another guy had gotten busted. They drove from Portsmouth to DC and stuck somebody up and were caught. I thought, all that promise gone down the drain again. I thought about all this as I sat there in 1991 listening to Marty run down his plans. I thought about his life, how he spent most of it in and out of the joint. I thought about how he'd blown several opportunities to straighten himself out. After about an hour, I left. I wrote him once or twice after that visit, but I never went back. I couldn't bring myself to look Marty in the eye and tell him I no longer believed he'd do what he said he would. When Jim asked me why I hadn't been back to see my homeboy, I told him that I no longer held out much hope for Marty. I'm not sure he's as committed as he says he is. Several months after that visit, we lost contact. Marty was transferred to another institution farther away from DC. Then he eventually made parole again. I often reflected on what made the difference between Marty and me. We were similar in many ways. Although we both had done bad things, we were basically well-intentioned dudes trying to find our way in the world. I concluded that the distinction between us came down to some simple things that were simple and at the same time very complex. Marty and his siblings had been raised by their mother in the Jeffrey Wilson Projects, a neighborhood of mostly single mothers and shiftless men who hung around. Life there hadn't convinced Marty there was another way. None of the grand assertions that people make about human potential were ever concrete to him. Whenever he got out of prison, he went back to Jeffrey Wilson and hung out, even after his family moved away. I think he felt unwelcome anywhere else. The world outside his neighborhood had never opened its doors to let him see what he could really be and do. But I come from a stronger, intact family in a neighborhood where there were lots of hardworking, right-doing black men and women whose lives demonstrated that there were many alternatives to life in the streets. There had always been some older person, a teacher, a neighbor, a relative, to encourage me when I faltered or fallen down. Even when I chose the gutter, I had always had a frame of reference for a better life. That made all the difference in the world. It made a difference, too, when it came time for me to pass along the kind of support that had been given to me. A few months after I moved to DC, Liz called from California. "I'm sending Monroe to you." I said nothing, waiting to hear more. Actually, I'd been expecting that phone call for some time. Once before when Liz had called, she sounded frustrated. Monroe had gotten into trouble. He and some other boys tried to steal some things from a record shop and got caught. There had been other, more subtle signs of trouble in the previous year. Monroe was becoming more defiant towards Liz and aloof toward his stepfather and two half-brothers. He was behaving in a way that nobody understood. But I understood, and I knew it was time for him to come to me. Every time I mentioned it to Liz, she'd go off. "You must be crazy. You didn't do anything for him when he was very young. Now you're trying to say you want to get custody of him?" She was right. But her refusal to hand him over was based on her judgment of the guy she'd known in the past. She hadn't seen much of me in the 11 years since I had gotten out of prison, and she had no idea how much I had changed. But Monroe wanted to see more of me, just like I had hungered for my old man when I was a boy. It was hard strengthening the bond when we lived 2,000 miles apart. Our relationship was restricted largely to the telephone. That drove me up the wall sometimes and made me feel helpless and inept. I was sure that if I had him with me, I could compete with the pressures he'd get from school and neighborhood peers. But with little say in the matter, I resigned myself to do what I could during the summers when he visited me in Atlanta. We did the usual things that fathers and sons do. We played basketball and went to the movies, but we also talked, shared, and hugged. We talked a lot about the streets so he wouldn't get a glorified perspective from uninformed peers. I had taken him bike riding through the streets and point out drug dealers and prostitutes. I told him everything about my past, including the experience with doing time. I even drove him to Southampton a few times and ran down in graphic detail the horrors of prison. Of course, we talked a lot about racial matters too. One summer, when he was about 15, I took Monroe to apply for a job at the Six Flags Over Georgia amusement park. It reminded me of my frustrating times job hunting when I was a teen. All the white kids his age were working in air-conditioned buildings, and the black kids were given outdoor jobs cleaning up the amusement park. I told him, "You may as well get ready. This is what you're going to have to contend with all your life." In July 1989, after Monroe had spent another summer vacation with me, he asked if he could live with me instead of returning home. I sensed a desperation in him that I hadn't seen before. When I talked with Liz about it again, her response was the same: "No way." I didn't want to start another war with her, yet I didn't want Monroe to think I had turned my back on him. When it was time for him to return to California, we struck a deal. I told him to give it another try. If it isn't working out for you by the mid-semester mark, call me and I'll send you a ticket. I had no idea how soon I'd see him again. When Liz called a few months later, she said she found a letter that Monroe was composing to her. In the letter, he explained why he wanted to live with me. He said he feared that if he didn't live with me before graduating from high school, he might never get a chance to get to know you well, Liz said. "That's what's convinced me to let him come to you." I resisted the temptation to gloat. Her voice was already shaky. Monroe was her firstborn, and she felt she was losing him. By December, Monroe was standing in the terminal at Washington National Airport waiting for his luggage. Right away, he entered the 11th grade, starting his new life, and settled into my tiny one-bedroom apartment where he slept on the living room couch. Suddenly, my life was no longer my own. I had a teenage son and 3 immediate goals: to help him prepare for his future, whatever he chose, to keep him away from macho pressures to hang in the streets, and to keep him alive in a city where young black males treat each other like targets on a shooting range. I was really concerned because of our schedules. Monroe got out of school at 3 in the afternoon. I got off work at 7, on a good day. Most days I worked until 9 or 10, and if I could get a cab, got home by 11. I was uneasy with all the time Monroe would spend alone. At work, I constantly got visions of some gang members approaching my son, asking him for money or his clothing, then pointing the gun to his head and firing, just for the hell of it. I came up with strategies to minimize the risk. I made sure he came nowhere near to being sharply dressed in school. No expensive sneakers or flashy clothes that might entice jealous dudes to go after him. I drilled him on ways to handle different street scenarios and coached him on how to respond if approached by hoods. If somebody asks you for your coat, don't put up a fuss. Just take it off and hand it to them without a word. "We can always get you another coat," I said. Although I schooled him on practically every potential situation that came to mind, it still wasn't enough to calm my nerves. Every time I read a news story about some teenage boy being gunned down over some senseless shit, I got visions of my son in subway encounters or neighborhood brawls. My fears about his safety forced me to come to grips with a troubling reality. As much as I ranted about white folks messing with us, I felt more threatened, physically, by my own people and the powerful self-hatred driving them. Eventually, I took a final precaution to ease my mind. I got Monroe out the path of the urban storm and moved to Arlington, just across the river, where the violence seemed less intense. I still worried about him and sensed that the cultural pull of the pseudo-macho hip-hop fads was even more powerful than the things that once influenced me. I began to see signs of that after he met and started hanging with some cats at a local basketball court. He bopped with a more pronounced pimp and started letting his baggy jeans fall lower on his behind. He suddenly became more resistant to doing household chores and took on that arrogant body language that teenagers use as their coded way of telling their parents to go to hell. Finally, when things started getting out of hand, I had to yoke him, Cavalier Manor style, break down that macho facade so he'd be real clear on what manhood was and was not about. It didn't take a whole lot to bring him around. I think it helped that Liz and his stepfather had instilled in him a foundation of decency. After that, we talked a lot about serious things, including girls, sex, and other matters of the heart. I learned from those rap sessions that little had changed on the street since I was there. He came into my bedroom late one night and asked, "Is it all right to take it from a girl if you take her out and she won't give it up?" I guess it was something he heard in bathroom rap with other dudes, and I flashed back to those street corner discussions that had shaped my views. After he posed the question, I paused a long while before I said anything. I wondered, what can I say to him now? How can I tell him not to do the things that I have done? Finally, I told him about the things we did to girls while growing up and explained how much I regretted it now. I couldn't bring myself to preach to him, but I presented the issue in a way that hit close to home. Monroe was always paranoid about guys hungrily eyeing Liz in public, so I used her as an example of the danger in viewing other females, girls and women, as pieces of meat. I asked him, how would you feel if somebody decided they could rape your mother just because she won't give it up? He paused. I'd be mad. Then think about it that way with other girls. He said he understood. That's how we got through everything. Talking, communicating, doing something my parents' generation hadn't been taught to do. I often wondered during those talks with Monroe how I might have turned out if I had had somebody I could talk to about everything. When Monroe graduated from high school in 1991, my parents drove up from Portsmouth and Liz flew in from California to see him march. He walked down the aisle, got his diploma, and became my parents' first grandchild to graduate from high school. We threw a cookout and invited his friends. As I watched them playing music, laughing and joning, I saw a cycle that brought back memories. I wondered if Monroe was as fearful of facing the hostile white world as I'd been on my graduation day. Watching him, I felt a lot of things. Mostly, though, I felt glad that Monroe was not in trouble and was college bound. I felt proud and confident that he skipped the rite of passage to prison that I went through. Okay, this brings us to the end of chapter 43. And something interesting that he said at the very end is that he was proud that his son was going to miss that rites of passage that he went through of going to prison. It's interesting that we don't have a culture anymore where we have a defined rite of passage that marks our transition from boyhood into manhood. I feel that I was lucky in the sense that I went through a rites of passage when I was in high school. I was a member of an organization called the Alpha Scholars Alliance. And it was a process. There were things that I had to do, information that I had to learn. But going through that process, I can see the before and after. It definitely changed me for the better. I grew more confident in my abilities and who I was as a person. And, I went through more rites of passages as I went off to college. I became a member of Kappa Kappa Psi National Honorary Band Fraternity, There was a process getting into that. And I became a member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. And there was a process for that as well. And, I can see the science of it. Now, what's interesting is that there's a book called The Aquarian Gospels of Jesus to Christ. And that title is interesting because they called him Jesus the Christ, meaning that was a title that you earned. And back in Jesus' time, you could go through a process and you came out with those abilities. What's very interesting to me is that, we're doing these rites of passages now, but we just come out and become members of a fraternity or an organization. It's not the same as when Jesus was doing it. It's almost as if that information has been lost. I think I'll talk about that book a little bit more in another video. But there's another book that I have by Muwata Ashby. It's called The Mystical Journey from Jesus to Christ. And again, it's just emphasizing that this was something that had to be learned to gain those abilities. I always go back to what Jesus said in the Bible. He said, "Behold, you will do greater works than me." And you think about all the things that he was able to do. And I think about us not having that knowledge and all the trouble that we seem to get ourselves into. Like, we know the prison pipeline is a real thing. But it's almost like we seem unable to extract ourselves from that cycle. And it's interesting that, we're talking about cycles in this chapter today. I'm reading the book called The Fourth Turning. And it's about essentially how everything goes through cycles. It's like reoccurring. People go through cycles and nations as well. And that book is about the cycle that America is going through. Well, you can correlate that down to yourself. We all have our spring, we have our summer, we have our fall, and we have our winter. Now you have, you're new to life. You have your summer where you're reaching that maturity. And then you have that eventual decline as you reach old age. And then the end, which is winter. I think it's interesting that we don't spend more time thinking about these cycles that we find ourselves in and how they have lasting consequences. Nathan McCall running trains on girls, like that was a normal thing, or, just having unprotected sex with women. It started this cycle off of him having a daughter out there that he didn't spend any time in her life. He didn't meet her again until she was almost grown and about to have a baby of her own. And that cycle continued. I don't know if he's going to find out or if he's going to tell us in the next chapter if that child was really his or not. But it's just something, all these fatherless homes that we have. That's the cycle that we definitely need to break. So I always, caution and remind brothers, be careful who you lay down with so you don't have a child coming up not knowing their father or being raised in a single parent household. We've been given this idea that, it takes two people to make a child, but only one person to raise them. That's not true in the least. You need both of your parents. You need that balance between the masculine and the feminine. Thinking about what he said about Monroe, he got around his friends and he started to feel himself. And his dad had to use that masculine energy, like to yoke him up and show him, hey, man, you ain't as tough as you think you are. But, young men need that. They need to know, okay, there's a hierarchy to this. But anyway, make sure you guys click that link in the description to check out my ebook, Free Your Mind to Have Peace of Mind. And I'll see you guys in the next chapter. Peace. Okay, also, side note, we have exactly one more chapter to go. So after we finish this chapter, I'll do a video, just recapping all of this. This is quite a story. I searched Nathan McCall's name on Instagram just to see if he had a profile on there. But what came up wasn't his profile, but a bunch of people who had read this book and how much it impacted their life. It's powerful when you can leave a work like this that people can learn from. Because this was published back in 1994. And here we are all these years later in 2024, and it's still changing lives. It's still impacting people. And that's powerful. That's something that I think we owe it to the people who come after us, is to leave lessons behind for them so they can avoid some of the pitfalls that we fall into. But all right, I'll see you guys in the next and final chapter. Peace.